What does this look like to you? Well, to me, it looks like a can of food. But what is it really? If we were to look at it with an objective eye, what is this really? This is energy in a can. As preppers, what we do is we store energy. You see, civilization right now has an abundance of energy at its disposal, and it's found very efficient, sophisticated ways to utilize that energy to make amazing commodities like this. This went through an incredible process to create. It had to be cultivated from the land, it had to be manufactured and packaged, and the packaging itself took a lot of energy to create, and all of the additives and preservatives that went in there, and the fuel to fuel that whole process on top of it. So there's a lot of energy that goes into these types of commodities, namely food. And as preppers, what we do is we try to store that energy. We try to utilize the grid while it's up and running and everything is running fine, so that in times of disaster, we have a reservoir of stored energy to utilize in order to stay alive. Now, some preppers go even further than that to try to regenerate their own energy using the land, or that could be harvesting sunlight through solar panels or the wind through a turbine. Some preppers procure energy off the land in the form of hunting, taking the deer or the moose or whatever other wild game's energy and trying to make that energy useful for us. That's what preparedness is all about. And it's on a spectrum from preppers who simply stockpile energy to preppers who actually regenerate and recreate and prosume their own energy. The fuel canisters you see behind me here are really a means to an end. They're really a means to ensure that we have shelter, that we have safety, that we have climate control, that we are able to transport ourselves if need be, that we're able to grow food, pump water or make water drinkable, administer various types of more sophisticated medicine that rely on technology, power our electronic devices. So in that way then, this right here is exactly the same as that. The only difference is it's in a different form. So today we're going to talk about the different types of fuel that you can store for the purpose of powering your electronics, powering a vehicle, heating your home, or even cooking. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of each of these different types of fuel and some special considerations and storage requirements that you're going to have to take into consideration. We're also going to talk about how you can extend the shelf life of some of these different types of fuel. So without further ado, let's get to it. Now, one of the biggest assets you're going to have after disaster strikes is going to be your vehicle. Your vehicle isn't only a way to transport you, but it's also a means of sheltering you. It's a means of keeping you warm, and it's probably one of the best, safest, and most legal ways of storing large amounts of fuel. This is why it's always important that you keep your gas tank as topped up as possible. Some people even go so far as to put an auxiliary fuel tank on their vehicle in order to store more fuel. A vehicle is also essentially a power generator, albeit one that comes at a high energy expenditure. Nonetheless, you can still charge your electronics with your vehicle. So a vehicle is a very multi-purpose SHTF tool. So even an old beater, in this instance, could potentially be very useful in a post-disaster situation. Even if you don't drive and you tend to take the bus a lot, having a vehicle at your disposal, even if it's a cheap old beater that you're not really going to drive that much, as long as you're cycling that gas through, as we're going to talk about today, using the proper stabilizers, then it's definitely an asset if things get down to the wire. Okay, so starting over here, we got the gasoline in our Army Green style canister. This typically comes in a red canister, but it also comes in Army Green, of course. And then we have our diesel, which always comes in yellow. We have our kerosene, which always comes in blue. Down here, we have fuel stabilizers that are going to extend the life of these different types of fuel. Then we have our larger refillable propane tank. We have our non-refillable smaller propane tanks. We have our Coleman white gas, aka camp fuel. We have our rubbing alcohol. We have our paraffin wax or paraffin oil. We have our isobutane and butane canisters. We have some Mazola canola oil. This could be any type of vegetable oil, and I don't have motor oil here, but that's another source of fuel. We also have some methanol gel, which is another form of alcohol. And then we have some candles, we have some solar generators, and of course, our solar panels. Now let's talk about the various attributes of all these different types of fuel and their best use cases for preppers and survivalists. Now, one of the most abundant forms of fuel that's available to everybody is gasoline. Some of the benefits of gasoline is that it's everywhere. 97% of the cars run on it. So if you were to have to jerry-rig a vehicle together post-collapse or some Mad Max thing like that, chances are it's going to run on good old gasoline. Also, a lot of generators run off this stuff. And because it's so abundant means it's so readily accessible. Well, at least now it is. Consider that if 97% of cars run on gasoline, then chances are if there's a run on gas, there's going to be some pretty long lineups, and we've seen this on countless occasions in disasters in the past. This is why a lot of preppers, if possible, prefer diesel. I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. Now, in terms of the downsides of gasoline, one of the potential downsides is the short shelf life, or relatively short shelf life, I should say, of between 3 months to 12 months. Now, after 3 months, the fuel, depending on how it's stored, is going to definitely start to degrade. And if you use that fuel in your machines, then it's going to potentially degrade your machines. They call that contaminated gas because it oxidizes and it's hydrophilic, it attracts water, and that's not good for the machinery. It can lead to corrosion and other problems like that you certainly don't want to have, especially if you're talking about a Mad Max cyberpunk type universe where you have to jerry-rig everything, and the last thing you want to do is be putting toxic fuel into your machines. So this is why storing the fuel is so important. Now, myself personally, I don't like storing the same gasoline or the same fuel in general for long periods of time. I like to cycle it through and continue to cycle it through. That way you always have something fresh and you always know that you're going to be able to maximize the shelf life if a disaster were to strike at any point. Now, some of the factors that are going to impact that shelf life are going to be the ethanol content of the gasoline. Most gasoline in North America is blended with ethanol. And some of the downsides of ethanol is that you're not going to be getting as great a fuel efficiency with the ethanol-based gasoline, but more importantly for preppers is that it's not going to store as long. Now, you can extend the shelf life as you could with normal gasoline with fuel stabilizers, but in the end, you're still going to get a shorter lifespan because it is hydrophilic, meaning it attracts water vapor, and of course water vapor is not good in your machines and in your gasoline. It's going to cause the gas to separate into its different components, and then there's also the issue that it's oxidizing. So the more air that's in your canisters, the more problematic and the faster your fuel is going to be basically destabilized, okay? And that's why you need to add fuel stabilizer to the fuel. Now, you still do want to leave some air in the canisters in case they have to flex a little bit, because even these canisters here, which are standard UN certified NATO mil spec, they're made of a high density polyethylene material, a very, very thick plastic, military grade stuff. Even these really thick ruggedized plastics, they will expand and contract depending on the heat where they're stored. That's part of the reason why you should try to store them at a constant temperature as possible and try to store it as far away from sleeping people as possible for obvious reasons. And that should be the same for all the fuel you have, with the exception of a few types of fuel which aren't as hazardous to keep around you that we're going to talk about today. So how you store the fuel is really up to you. I find that these smaller canisters are a bit easier to lug around. Even a full canister, which could be between 40 and 50 pounds when full, anybody can pretty much carry that, or most people. Not everybody's going to be able to carry anything larger than that, okay? And you can get larger gasoline reservoirs, and I'll post a few links to those in the description. But bear in mind, you need a way to transport those to constantly fill them up. So unless you have a truck or a forklift, or effectively some means of transporting one of those, or if you have a fuel truck that comes to you want to fill it up periodically, if you live in the countryside or something like that, then something like that might not be that practical. Whereas something like this is far more practical, and they're just a little bit easier to fill up as well. Because if you have to walk with one of them or something like that, especially in the case of emergency, can definitely come in handy. Now, there are metal gas canisters that have the same form factor, and they don't tend to expand and contract as much. And the only problem with those is I've heard that they can potentially rust. Of course, you're not going to have a problem with these. I'm going to post a link to the metal jerry cans and these ones as well in the description, because I do believe it's worth investing in a solid canister that's going to last. You can get those red ones, which are great for, you know, an emergency vehicle kit, but if you're talking about long-term preparedness, you're going to want to get something very rugged and durable. Now, it's very important that if you're going to store any of the fuels that I'm going to talk about today, that you consult your local bylaws just to make sure you're within regulations. Because the last thing you want is a fine, or, you know, you just want to be as safe as possible for obvious reasons. Those rules exist for a reason. Now, I should also say that you may even want to have different fuels, even if you don't have machines necessarily to use those fuels yet. There's something to be said about just having some versatility. That could be for the purpose of trade or barter. There are some fuels that we're going to be talking about today that are going to last a lot longer. So even if you might not be able to use them or have a use case yet, there may come a time when you might need them. And going back to the original claim of this video, that preppers store energy, and all energy is potentially useful. So if you come across some energy and you can store it in a safe way, why not store it? Now, up next is a fuel known as diesel. Now, for many preppers, diesel has a special place in their heart for a variety of reasons we're going to get into. However, there are some drawbacks to consider. One of the main benefits often quoted by preppers is that diesel is a more denser form of fuel than gasoline. So for example, both of these containers are the exact same size. Both contain the same volumetric amount of fuel. However, this diesel canister can generate 15% more energy than this gasoline canister. That means that if you have a diesel vehicle, you're going to be able to travel further on this than you would on this. Now, diesel vehicles are notoriously more complicated and more expensive than gasoline vehicles, which is why only 3% of people have them. And a lot of those are going to be the bigger trucks and the heavier equipment that require that level of fuel efficiency and the power that can be generated by diesel. However, a diesel vehicle with proper maintenance will likely outlast its gasoline counterpart. Now, there's also some other benefits to diesel engines in that they can be modified to run on alternative types of fuel, like vegetable oil, for instance. Why you would want to do that, I don't know. I guess some people figure that, you know, after all of the wells have dried up, then there's still going to be a lot of veggie oils at the fast food restaurants that nobody's going to think about. Okay, maybe in the one-off Mad Max situation, that's something that could be plausible. I'm not quite sold on the idea, but hey, it's great to have a wide array of choices at your disposal. Another benefit of diesel is that it's less volatile than gasoline. You can ignite gasoline by looking at it the wrong way. Diesel, it takes a bit more work. Gasoline will ignite at the slightest spark, but with diesel, you know, it requires more heat and more pressure. So if you're worried about storing large amounts of fuel, diesel in some respects may be slightly safer than gasoline. Now, one of the other benefits of diesel is that because it's a hardier fuel, it's actually going to keep a lot longer than gasoline. One of the main benefits of diesel for long-term preparedness, in my opinion, is the shelf life. It's going to last longer without fuel stabilizers than will gasoline. Now, not a whole lot longer, but significantly longer, between 3 to 4 times longer, which, because gasoline doesn't keep that long, it's not really saying that much. But again, if you properly stabilize the fuel at regular intervals, you can definitely extend the life for a long, long time. However, I fail to imagine how you would ever find yourself in a situation, especially a long-term grid down one, where you are sitting on that large amount of fuel for so long, unless you are running some post-apocalyptic gas station. And I'm pretty sure that the reserves would be dried up pretty quickly in that scenario. This is why the shelf life of the fuel is not a huge factor for me personally, because if you think about how long a year or two is in that sort of environment, chances are you're going to use up your fuel long before you have to worry about it going bad. Now, in terms of storing diesel, it's exactly the same as gasoline. You want it to be a well-ventilated area with no open flames, no pilot lights, away from people who are sleeping, as far away on your property as possible, if possible. Now, part of the reason why I don't store large amounts of fuel where I live is because it's very cold. Now, even though gasoline and diesel will be able to withstand some pretty low temperatures, you start to have lots of wear and tear on the reservoirs themselves at those temperatures. And myself personally, I just don't like leaving things out in -30. It just doesn't seem right. So I would advise trying to keep a relatively cold temperature in a well-ventilated, low humidity space. And I personally have a detached heated garage. I just put the heating in, and I store it at the far side of my heated garage, which is as far away from my home as possible. One last benefit of the diesel engine, and I commented on this earlier, is that you can run biodiesel through these engines. And of course, diesel, you can find diesel generators, diesel heaters, which I'm going to show you in a little bit, and of course diesel vehicles. So all of these things can run off biodiesel. I don't know anything about the process of making biodiesel, but I think that would be the only sustainable way to imagine yourself driving a combustion engine vehicle long-term in a grid down situation, is if you had some way to create your own fuel. I think we're going to have to save that video for another day. Now, one of the other benefits of diesel in an SHTF situation, no matter which gas station you go to, there tends to be a diesel pump there. Maybe there's 10 gas pumps and one of them happens to be diesel, okay? Now, most gas stations have pretty substantial diesel reservoirs, and because 97% of vehicles run on gasoline, well, you can imagine that the gasoline is going to dry up a lot faster than the diesel will. That's another rationale for having diesel, is that it's going to be in greater abundance if something were to happen. The only problem with that is that if you do have a diesel, you have to be mindful of where you're getting your diesel from. Because if you have fuel that's been sitting there in the bottom of a reservoir for 6 months because nobody, uses or gets diesel from there, that could potentially be doing more damage to your vehicle. So if I did have a diesel, I'd be making sure that I'd be gassing up at those places where I knew, the diesel was going to be cycled quite frequently. Up next has to be the ultimate prepper fuel. If there was one fuel that could rule them all, it would likely be propane. You can practically do everything with propane. You can cook your food with it. You can run a generator with it, which of course can power all of your electronics. You can even modify certain vehicles to run on it. And of course, you can heat your home with it. Probably one of the most important things in surviving a Canadian winter. And in addition to that, we've all seen those zombie movies where they shoot the propane tank and all the zombies go boom. Well, as you can imagine, there's probably some tactical applications to this as well. The only problem with it is just that it's highly explosive. It's highly volatile. The propane inside this tank is essentially never going to go bad. It has an indefinite shelf life. However, the valves, the fittings, and even the actual metal housing, depending on what it's made of and depending on where you store it, may be prone to corrosion. And of course, that can weaken the seal, which can lead to leaks, and leaks go boom. So that's not a good thing. Now, the advantages in using this in a propane-based generator is that those generators are known to be a lot more reliable, a lot more cleaner burning, and they just generally last longer than gasoline or diesel generators. And the problem with your degraded gasoline and diesel fuel is that if you are using fuel stabilizers and you're running that fuel at the end of its life cycle through your machines, that can damage the machines. That's never going to be a factor with propane. One of the biggest downsides with propane is going to be the cost. Of course, the tanks themselves cost a pretty penny. And then of course you have to look into your bylaws and any sort of storage restrictions, because as it is more volatile, there's an explosive risk, and thus it's going to come at a higher cost. So up next is another prepper favorite, and that is kerosene. Now, a lot of people like kerosene because it's much safer to use. It has a much higher ignition point, meaning that it's going to take a lot more heat to ignite it. It is, in some cases, interchangeable with diesel. However, diesel has a slightly lower ignition point, so I'm not sure if it's good to run your engine with it long term, but I'm not an expert on that particular subject. I do know that you can put kerosene into a diesel powered generator. However, to the best of my knowledge, kerosene tends to be a lot more expensive. You can find it at most hardware stores. I think there's probably places where you can buy it in bulk as well, but that's going to depend on where you are locally. Now, kerosene, as you can see here, is typically stored in these blue containers. Diesel is yellow, gasoline tends to be red or green, and kerosene tends to be blue. And kerosene can store up to 5 years and longer if you add fuel stabilizers. So every year or so, adding fuel stabilizer to it just to make sure that the solution is stable. Kerosene is a great option for lighting, and not only just lighting. The difference between a lot of these electronic lanterns and candle lanterns and these types of fuel-based lanterns is that these give off a significant amount of heat, so BTUs. So while they do run on a finite fuel source, they are going to actually do more than just a normal electronic light which runs on solar power. These are actually going to keep you warm. And you can't rely on solar or electric to keep you warm. It's just going to take way too much energy. You know, that's why we rely on natural gas in order to heat our homes. There are some other unconventional ways of doing it using solar heating. However, those require a whole setup, which not everybody is going to have access to. And this video is just about the types of fuel to store. So it's definitely always good to have a little bit of kerosene around. It is very flammable. However, it's not as flammable and volatile as gasoline. So you might be able to sleep a little bit easier knowing that you have kerosene instead of gasoline stored. Some preppers suggest that you have all of your machines running on the same type of fuel just because it's going to be easier to keep track of. And I would say that while that's true and while it's going to make your life easier, you really don't know what sort of fuels are going to be in abundance after the crap hits the fan. So, you know, there may be excess amounts of gasoline, but no diesel or kerosene. If you have all of your stuff that runs on diesel, then, you know, you could potentially have a problem down the road not being able to use any of those tools. So that's why I say it might be a good idea to mix it up a bit. 80% of the fuel you store should be for your primary tools, but maybe 20% diversified, just like your stock portfolio. Now up next is this Coleman camp fuel, also known as white gas. Now this is a proprietary fuel which is only to be used in Coleman devices. But some of the benefits of this is that it lasts for 5 to 7 years without any fuel stabilizer in the container that you buy it in. And Coleman makes a lot of smaller appliances, stoves, and even lanterns and smaller heating systems. But unfortunately, this is not an ideal prepping fuel in my opinion, simply because of the fact that it is proprietary. Yes, you could probably use it in other devices. I haven't really researched that a lot, but just the fact that it's hard to find in itself, you know, it's going to be very specific as to where you can find this. It's going to be a specific hardware store that is going to sell this. And if you don't have Coleman appliances, I mean, it's a great marketing gimmick by them because it really encourages you to use their appliances. Then of course, you know, you're kind of SOL. But just like kerosene, it's not going to be as volatile as gasoline. So you can practically store it anywhere within reason. I would strongly advise against storing any of these fuels in your basement because if it springs a leak, a lot of these gases tend to be heavier than air and it's going to sink down to the bottom, to the floor. And if there's a pilot light by your water heater or something like that and it catches it, then that's all it really takes, right? So you definitely want to be very safe when considering where to store your fuel. Now, I don't have any denatured alcohol. I do have some rubbing alcohol here, which is 70%. The best type of alcohol, the higher percentage, the easier it's going to burn. Now, this is what they call a methanol gel cooking fuel. And this can last up to 2.5 hours, which is pretty substantial considering this will run you anywhere between $1 to $4, depending on where you buy it. So it's relatively inexpensive for the amount of heat that you're getting out of it. And it's a very stable gel, so you can store this in your apartment, not have to worry about it. That's one thing to be considerate of, is that if you do live in an apartment building and you're trying to store some fuels, methanol gels or various types of alcohol stoves are probably the safest way you can go. And you can see they light relatively easy, can get a lot of heat, and it has that nice blue flame, burns really hot. So you're going to be able to heat up your food in relatively short order. You can use them indoors, and they're just really convenient. It's not a dirty fuel. It's very clean burning. It's no mess. You don't have to be messing around with pouring fuel in different things or anything like that. And then when you're ready to be done with it, you just throw the cap on, give it a minute to cool down, of course, and put her in your backpack, and you're on your way. And it also doesn't smell. So, in terms of a bug out type fuel, something like this definitely is worth considering, in my opinion. You can also get those Nesbit cubes, which I personally am not a big fan of, but there's something to be said about those as well, in that it's a clean burning source of fuel. It's a little bit more messy than this, but I guess the benefit of those is that you can really just put them in a backpack. You don't need a canister or anything like that. You can carry them in pretty much anything and burn them pretty much anywhere. And they have an indefinite shelf life. So, these are some types of fuel that you might want to store if you live in an apartment building. Now, another fuel that I was only recently exposed to is this paraffin oil. Better take the cap off first before I light this. So these are clean burning. You can burn them indoors. Primarily, it's going to be used as a lighting source. So it's basically like a liquid candle. And I'm guessing the benefits are that it's going to last a bit longer, and it's going to be a little bit less waxy and messy than a candle would. So yeah, paraffin wax is another consideration. As previously indicated, you can make a light or heat source out of everyday cooking oil, or even alcohol that you might have, olive oil. Any type of oil is essentially just like the oil we pull out of the ground to run our cars, only it might have a higher combustion point. So it's going to apply a bit more heat, or it's going to require a wick in order to burn. So, that's something to consider, is that, if you have a lot of this stuff in your home and you're getting really cold, and obviously you always want to make sure that you have a adequate ventilation with any of the heating systems that you're going to use indoors, and you're going to want to make sure that they're rated for indoor use. It doesn't hurt to have a carbon monoxide detector around, one that runs on rechargeable batteries if possible. I'll post some links for those in the description, because the last thing you want to do, especially if you're burning these types of combustibles indoors, even if you have ventilation, you want to be on the safe side just to make sure that you're not killing your brain cells, okay? Now the next type of fuel, which is really more backpacker oriented, not really for preppers, but worth mentioning anyways, is these isobutane mixtures. Now, depending on the company that you buy this from, they might have their own proprietary mixture. It's very similar to propane in that it has an indefinite shelf life, but it's also a bit lighter than propane, which is why it's preferred by a lot of backpackers. So you can pack it in, the canisters tend to be lighter and smaller, and it just has more efficient burning than propane. So for that reason, a lot of backpackers like to use it, and it's really great stuff if you can get it. I've used this in the backcountry for many, many years. It's incredibly safe, and it works really fast, works really quick. It's compatible with a lot of, like I say, proprietary systems like the jet boil system. We sell ones from MSR that are also really good, the wind burner series. And yeah, that you can get them in small, large, medium. Really great fuel source, indefinite shelf life. Once again, it's worth having a few of these around. It's going to burn a little bit louder than your alcohol stove, and that's another benefit to those alcohol stoves, is that they're totally quiet. You can't quite hear. I'll put the microphone close to the isobutane stove, but that's what it sounds like. So it's a little bit loud. Now this is just a demonstration, but right now I'm breaking one of the rules. You should be using this in a well-ventilated space. Even though the carbon monoxide it gives off is going to be relatively minimal compared to a lot of these other fuels, you definitely want to use this in a ventilated space. But with this, you're going to be using it for such a short period of time that might not be a huge issue. And when you're done using it, you just turn it off just like that. Make sure that seal is nice and tight, and that should store for as long as the seals are gonna last on it. Now I figured I would keep the candle here for cinematic effect. Really nice candles, these paraffin wax candles. They seem to burn a lot better than normal candles. Anyways, wood is great because it's abundant and essentially it's renewable. The uses for wood fuel are numerous. Everything from using a wood stove to just having a campfire to cooking your food on it, cooking with it in a barbecue, you know, like using wood chips. Some people in previous times and even today run vehicles on it. They build gasification systems, which can be fairly complex and difficult to maintain. But if you're willing to, you know, commit yourself to that, you can make a car run off wood gas. But it's a challenging endeavor to say the least, and it's not a very clean burning fuel. So a lot of people in World War II, they did that in order to save money on gasoline, but they ended up incurring a lot of costs in just maintaining the vehicles because it's a very dirty fuel. So it requires a lot of filtration. Now, firewood, when properly stored and seasoned, can last for a significant amount of time. It's definitely not going to be indefinite. After all, it's organic material. Well, like most of these things were at one point. So it's going to last around 5 years before it starts to break down and decay and start to rot, depending on the conditions you keep it in. If you keep it in a relatively well-ventilated space where there's shade, where it's not exposed to a whole lot of moisture, it's going to keep a lot longer. It really depends a lot on the type of wood that you're storing. There's a spectrum of wood which ranges from hardwood to softwood. Softwood is going to burn a lot faster. Softwood is more geared towards, you know, a fast burning fire, one which is going to burn at a higher heat, whereas a hardwood fire is going to last a lot longer. It's going to burn at a much more smoother, consistent heat. So preferably hardwoods are what you would go for. Now, you can buy wood off Craigslist or Kijiji. I would not recommend buying it from your local grocery store where they charge you 10 bucks for a few logs. You know, if you can, kick back 150 or 200 bucks. Somebody will drop you off a cord of wood or a half cord of wood. Every other season, I order a cord of wood through Canada's Craigslist, which is called Kijiji. I find someone on there who's selling wood. Usually they're selling birch or some type of seasoned hardwood, and you definitely want to make sure it's seasoned. Most of these guys, you know, they know what they're doing, so they're only going to sell you the seasoned stuff because they know you're not going to come back if you buy the green wood. But some of them will sell you the green wood, which is basically wood which has just been fresh cut, okay? And that requires a year or two in order to be usable because it's not going to be dry enough, and it's going to require more energy just to heat it up than it's actually going to give off when it burns. So you can get that stuff cheaper if you're willing to season it for a couple of years yourself. So that's an option as well, but you can get a much better deal. I mean, the markup on that stuff that you're paying for at 7-Eleven or wherever the case might be is probably tenfold, 10x at least, compared to what you would buy it if you bought it in bulk. And the stuff you buy in bulk is usually better quality, in my opinion, but just make sure that the cuts of the wood, remember that if they're offering you a full cord of wood, which is cut into fine pieces, you're actually getting less amount of wood. So there's a benefit in that you don't have to do as much chopping, but you're getting less amount of substance, of density of wood when it's more finely cut up. Similar types of fuel in this vein are going to be things like charcoal or even coal. Coal is in a very abundant form of fuel which is out there and readily available. Obviously, it doesn't burn that clean, but you know, there still are a lot of power plants around the world that use it to generate electricity. So a coal-fired generator is something that I've considered, although I just don't have the expertise in order to innovate something like that. But you know, if you're thinking long-term Mad Max, you know, that might be one of the things that resurfaces the coal train, you know, the coal-fired train, or you know, the coal-fired furnace, or whatever the case might be. So that's definitely something you might want to look into as well. Now, last but not least, we have our solar option. Now, unfortunately, solar power, and like most renewable energy, it's not as efficient and a dense form of energy as is the combustibles that we've used. We haven't quite fine-tuned the ability to harness enough amount of energy from the sun with the volume of panel that we have to generate a lot of electricity. Enough electricity that we could heat a home. Heating takes an incredible amount of energy, and unfortunately, unless you have a very large solar array, it's likely that you're not going to be able to effectively heat your home, especially through one of these long, cold Canadian winters. However, using renewable energy is much better than using some of these combustibles if you're talking about powering your electronics, even running refrigerators and things like that. Things which we may not necessarily always need, but might be great assets to our lives. So until we get the Cybertruck with the fold-out solar panels, and until you have a 2,000 watt at least array of solar panels in order to power the truck, well, chances are you're not going to be doing the things with your solar-based generator than you would with your gasoline or propane-based generator. But there are several benefits, especially if you live in an apartment building. Number one, they're quiet. You can run them indoors. They're much lighter, and you can transport them a lot easier than you can a lot of these obnoxiously loud generators, which of course are eventually going to run out. Now, if you have solar panels, even a small solar panel on one of these smaller generators, well, that's going to provide you essentially, well, I won't want to say an indefinite, because eventually after 1,000 odd, recharge cycles, your battery is going to start to diminish in its ability to hold a charge, but it's going to be a while before you get to that point. Now, as you can see here, I have two generators. This is the Energy Apex. Many people who watch the channel know that I rave about that one a lot. It's been one of the most reliable generators that I've had. There's been a lot of generators that I've been sent that have come to market. This is just, it's kind of like a diesel, it's reliable for me anyways. It's been very reliable, and it's just a very robust, very simple, clean design, one that if I'm going on a trip for 7 days or more, I take the Energy Apex. Now, they're coming out with a brand new model, which is going to be modular, which I think is going to totally change the game of solar generators, and they're still accepting pre-orders from that. They're going to be shipping in January. Of course, there's been supply chain disruptions with the LG battery cells, which are in huge demand right now. That's the top of the hop battery cell that they use for that. We also are actually selling these Nitecore mini generators. Now, these only are 300 watts, whereas the Apex is 1,500 watts. The new one is going to be 1,500 watts continuous, but this is more for your smaller electronics. And I do find myself gravitating towards this one a lot recently because it is super lightweight. The quality, the build quality of Nitecore products is really second to none. They're really the Apple of the tactical world. And you also can get this really lightweight 100 watt high efficiency solar panel. I think they boast 22% efficiency or something crazy like that. Now, I don't know if you're exactly getting that, but I have tested the panel. It does work really great, and I'm going to be doing a review on this little unit here. This is an excellent unit if you're going for weekend camping and you're not worried about, powering a refrigerator or anything big like that. You just want to run, laptops, tablets, walkie-talkies, your smaller, low power drain electronics, but it still puts out 300 watts with a 600 watt surge, has your high output USBs there, and DC output as well. So it's definitely a cool little generator, and it just feels really well made, really premium design. It does cost a pretty penny though, but I think what you're getting is worth it. But I'm gonna save that review for another day. So I hope you guys found this video somewhat useful today, talking about the wide array of fuels that are at your disposal, no matter what your situation, whether you live in the country or you live in a very small, congested apartment building. There are fuels that you can store that are gonna allow you to keep yourself warm, that are gonna provide you lighting, that are gonna provide you electricity, and maybe even run a vehicle. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, and if there's any other types of fuel that maybe I've missed or that you would like me to talk about more in depth in the future. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to click like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed the video. If you didn't enjoy the video, let me know as well. It helps me out with the algorithm. Thanks for watching, guys. Canadian Prepper out. All right, so I just want to quickly show you guys some options that you have. This is a dual fuel generator. I haven't really done an in-depth review on it because, quite honestly, I haven't used it that much. I've relied more on my solar generators, but that's definitely what you're going to want, something that can also run on propane or diesel or kerosene. And so that's obviously for the purpose of generating electricity. Then we have our Mr. Heater, space heater, smaller space heater, which runs strictly on propane. And I've used this for many years, works excellent. I actually have a smaller one as well, which will heat up a small tent. But actually in the dead of winter, even in a 4 or 6 man tent, that's usually just enough to kind of do the job for you. I can't remember the exact amount of square footage or BTUs. I think it's around 12,000 BTUs. So not a whole lot, but enough to heat a small room anyways. And over here, I just got this. This is a Mr. Heater Industrial. This runs on both diesel and kerosene. So yeah, I mean, that's a forced air heater. So you definitely want to have adequate ventilation. Now with these, depending on where you are and where you buy it, they may claim that you can use it indoors, but you should still have slight ventilation. However, in Canada, they're not rated for indoor use, but I know the exact same unit is rated for indoor use in the United States. So I guess they don't mind if you guys lose a few brain cells, but our government is a lot more of a nanny state, so they don't want us using them indoors. Regardless, just make sure you have adequate ventilation. With the forced air, when I've used these in the past, the back end was always, the exhaust was always, you know, being vented out of the tent that you're using it in. So you never want this, especially if you're burning diesel or kerosene, you never want this venting and sucking in those fumes, because, you know, the whole point is survival, and you ain't going to be surviving for long if you run any of these in a non-ventilated space, especially that guy right there. So yeah, that's just a few options. There's countless options. I'm going to post links in the description for a lot of this stuff if you guys want it, so be sure to check that out.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, your one-stop shop for premium, high-quality, brand-name products that have been tried and tested by myself and other YouTube gear reviewers. My subscribers save 10% off by using the coupon code SurvivalPrepper. All one word in all caps.